Hey everyone, get comfortable and settle in for tonight's story. We're going to talk about a case that involves a wealthy New England family, a $42 million fortune, and two deaths that may or may not have been murders. This is the story of the Carmen family and the Chocolos dynasty, a story about money, family dysfunction, and questions that may never be fully answered. As you listen to the rain falling softly in the background, let me take you through this complex case. It's a story that spans decades, involves multiple states, and centers on one young man named Nathan Carmen, who was either the unluckiest person in America or one of the most calculating killers of our time. So close your eyes, relax, and let me tell you about the $42 million inheritance that destroyed a family. Our story begins with a man named John Chocolos. John was a self-made millionaire who built his fortune from the ground up through real estate development. He wasn't born wealthy. He worked for everything he had. And by the time he reached his 80s, John Chocolos had accumulated an estate worth over $42 million. That's the kind of money most people can't even imagine. $42 million. Think about what you could do with that kind of wealth. You could buy multiple houses, travel the world first class for the rest of your life, never work another day, and still have money left over for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. John made his fortune primarily through developing nursing homes and care facilities throughout New England. He was shrewd, he was business-minded, and he understood real estate in a way that made him incredibly successful. He owned properties across Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. He made investments that paid off handsomely. By the 2000s, he was one of the wealthiest men in his region. But John Chocolos wasn't just about business. He was also deeply committed to his family. Or at least, that's what he believed and what he told people. His favorite saying, and people who knew him remember this clearly, was, "Without family you've got nothing, family is everything." John had 4 daughters. Their names were Linda, Janice, Emily, and Winsome. He raised them, provided for them, gave them every advantage his money could buy. And as they grew up and had children of their own, John extended that generosity to his grandchildren. But here's the thing about John Chocolos that becomes important as this story unfolds: he wasn't just generous with his money. He also used his money to maintain control over his family. Even after his daughters were grown women with their own lives and families, John kept them on monthly allowances through a living trust he'd established. Think about what that means. These were adult women, but they were still financially dependent on their father. He controlled the purse strings. And according to people who knew the family, John could be volatile. He had a temper. His relationship with his daughters was complicated, loving in some ways, but also controlling and sometimes difficult. Several family members have described John as having a dysfunctional relationship with his daughters. There were reports of him being occasionally violent or at least verbally aggressive. The family dynamic was complex, with undercurrents of tension that existed beneath the surface of this wealthy, successful family. But despite these complications, or perhaps because of them, John Chocolos was the center of the family universe. His money, his properties, his businesses, everything revolved around him. And everyone in the family knew that when John died, there would be a massive inheritance to be divided. $42 million, split among 4 daughters and eventually their children. That kind of money can bring families together. But as we'll see, it can also tear them apart. One of John's 4 daughters was named Linda. Linda Carmen was, by all accounts, a woman who tried hard to do right by everyone in her life. She had a complicated relationship with her father, like her sisters did, but she maintained close ties with him throughout his life. Linda married a man named Clark Carmen. Together they built a life in New England, and in 1994, they had a son. They named him Nathan. Nathan was their only child. Linda poured all her love and attention into being a mother. She wanted to give Nathan every opportunity, every advantage. She wanted him to be happy and successful and fulfilled. But Linda's marriage to Clark didn't last. They divorced when Nathan was still young, and Nathan went to live primarily with his mother. This meant Linda was essentially a single mother, raising a son on her own, though she had financial support from both her ex-husband and her father's generosity. Being a single parent is never easy, even when you have financial resources. Linda did her best. She tried to balance giving Nathan independence while also providing the structure and guidance she thought he needed. It was a delicate balance, and as we'll see, it became increasingly difficult as Nathan grew older. Linda worked various jobs over the years. She wasn't just living off her father's money, she had her own career, her own income, her own sense of independence, even though she knew she would eventually inherit a portion of her father's fortune. People who knew Linda describe her as kind, well-meaning, and someone who truly cared about other people. She had friends, she maintained relationships with her sisters despite occasional family tensions, and she tried to stay close to her father even when it wasn't always easy. But the most important relationship in Linda's life, the one that defined so much of her adult years, was her relationship with her son Nathan. She loved him deeply. And as we'll see, that love may have ultimately cost her everything. Nathan Carmen was born in 1994. From the very beginning, it was clear that Nathan was different from other children. He didn't interact with kids his age in typical ways. He struggled with social situations. He had difficulty understanding unspoken social rules that most children pick up naturally. When Nathan was young, he was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Specifically, what used to be called Asperger's syndrome before the diagnostic criteria changed. This meant that Nathan had above-average intelligence but significant challenges with social communication and interaction. Growing up with autism in the 1990s and early 2000s wasn't easy. There was less understanding about the autism spectrum then than there is now. Nathan struggled to make friends. Other kids didn't always understand him, and he didn't always understand them. He felt isolated and different. But Nathan found comfort and connection in animals. Specifically, he bonded deeply with a horse named Cruz. This horse became Nathan's best friend, his companion, the one living creature he felt truly understood by and connected to. The bond between Nathan and Cruz was profound and genuine. Nathan's parents tried to help him navigate the world. His mother Linda was particularly focused on getting him support, therapy, medication when needed, accommodations at school. But Nathan sometimes felt that his mother was being overprotective, even smothering. He wanted independence. He wanted to be treated like a normal teenager and young adult, not someone who needed constant supervision and intervention. This created tension between Linda and Nathan. It's a tension that exists in many parent-child relationships, but it was amplified by Nathan's autism and Linda's concerns about his well-being. She worried about him. He felt constrained by her worry. They loved each other, but they also clashed. Nathan attended school in New England, struggling through the social aspects while doing well academically in subjects that interested him. He was intelligent, there was no question about that. He could focus intensely on topics that captured his attention. He was analytical and detail-oriented. But socially and emotionally, Nathan had significant challenges. And when his beloved horse Cruz died, something in Nathan seemed to break. He had what was described as a psychotic episode at school. He started having paranoid delusions. At one point, he compared his school principal to the devil. His behavior became so concerning that Linda and Clark, despite their divorce, came together and agreed that Nathan needed more intensive help than they could provide at home. They made the difficult decision to sign over temporary guardianship of Nathan to a behavioral correction program. This wasn't because they didn't love him. It was because they were scared for him and didn't know how else to help him. Nathan spent time at this program, receiving treatment and support. Eventually, Nathan stabilized enough to return to regular life. But the experience left marks on him and on his relationship with his parents, particularly his mother. Nathan felt betrayed that his parents had sent him away. Linda felt she'd done what she had to do to keep her son safe. These are the kinds of family complications that exist in many households. Parents trying their best. A child struggling with his own challenges. Love mixed with frustration, mixed with fear, mixed with hope for the future. But while Nathan's relationship with his mother was complicated and his relationship with his father was somewhat distant, Nathan had one family relationship that seemed genuinely positive and uncomplicated: his relationship with his grandfather, John Shakalos. John absolutely doted on Nathan. Despite Nathan's social challenges and behavioral issues, John saw potential in his grandson. He saw intelligence, focus, drive. He saw a young man who reminded him of himself in some ways, someone who thought differently from other people, someone who was detail-oriented and analytical. John took Nathan under his wing. He brought Nathan to business meetings. Because John was hard of hearing in his later years, Nathan would sit beside him and take notes, helping his grandfather follow conversations and remember important details from meetings about his various real estate holdings and business ventures. For Nathan, these business meetings were fascinating. He was learning about real estate development, about investments, about how to build and maintain wealth. And he was learning from the most successful person he knew. His grandfather, who had built a $42 million empire from nothing. Nathan looked up to John immensely. John represented everything Nathan wanted to be: successful, respected, independent, wealthy. Nathan dreamed of following in his grandfather's footsteps and becoming a real estate developer himself. And John encouraged these dreams. He told Nathan stories about his business ventures. He explained his investment strategies. He promised Nathan that someday, Nathan would have the resources to build his own real estate empire. John funded Nathan's apartment when Nathan wanted to live independently. He gave Nathan money when Nathan needed it. He was supportive and encouraging in ways that Nathan didn't always feel from his parents, particularly his mother, who was always worried about whether Nathan was taking his medication or going to therapy or managing his autism effectively. To Nathan, his grandfather was the person who saw him as capable and competent, not as someone who needed constant help and intervention. That relationship meant everything to Nathan. So you can imagine how devastating it was for Nathan when, in December 2013, his beloved grandfather was murdered. It was a Sunday morning, December 15, 2013. John Shakalos was 87 years old and living in Windsor, Connecticut, in a comfortable home befitting a man of his wealth. Windsor is a quiet, affluent suburb just north of Hartford. It's the kind of place where violent crime is rare, where people feel safe, where millionaires can live peaceful retirements. That morning, John Shakalos was found dead in his home. But this wasn't a peaceful death from old age or natural causes. John had been shot. Multiple times. Someone had broken into his home and murdered him in cold blood. The scene was shocking. An 87-year-old man, killed violently in his own home. There were no signs of a struggle that would suggest John had fought back, which makes sense, given his age and the element of surprise. The killer had used a gun, firing multiple shots. It was quick, brutal, and appeared to be intentional rather than accidental or the result of a robbery gone wrong. The Windsor Police Department immediately launched an investigation. Who would want to kill an elderly man? What was the motive? Was this a random break-in by someone looking to rob a wealthy home? Or was it something more targeted, more personal? Investigators began by looking at John's life, his business dealings, his relationships. When you're investigating a murder, you always start with the people closest to the victim. And you always look at who benefits from the victim's death. In this case, the answer to who benefits was clear. John's 4 daughters and their children stood to inherit $42 million. That's a powerful motive for murder. But surely nobody in the family would kill John for money, would they? This was a family that claimed to value family above all else, echoing John's own favorite saying. Surely the daughters who have been supported by their father their entire lives wouldn't murder him. Surely the grandchildren who loved their grandfather wouldn't kill him. But investigators have seen enough cases to know that money can make people do terrible things. Family members have killed for far less than $42 million. So everyone had to be looked at, questioned, investigated. Pretty quickly, investigators' attention focused on one person in particular, Nathan Carmen. John's grandson. The young man who had been so close to his grandfather. The one who had accompanied John to business meetings and dreamed of following in his footsteps. Why did Nathan become a suspect? Let's walk through what investigators discovered. First, there was the issue of the gun. Investigators learned that Nathan owned firearms. Specifically, Nathan had purchased an assault-style rifle at some point before his grandfather's murder. The caliber of this rifle was consistent with the bullets that killed John Chocolos. When investigators asked Nathan about this rifle, Nathan's response was strange. He claimed he had forgotten about owning the gun. He said he couldn't remember what happened to it. He thought maybe he'd lost it or misplaced it somehow. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about forgetting where you put your keys or losing track of a book. We're talking about an assault rifle. A serious weapon. And Nathan claimed he just forgot about it. Lost it. Couldn't account for where it was. That struck investigators as highly suspicious. Most gun owners know exactly where their firearms are at all times. Guns are serious possessions. You don't just forget about them. Unless, of course, you have a reason to want that gun to disappear. Unless you used it for something and then needed to dispose of it. Second, there was the issue of Nathan's computer. Investigators discovered that Nathan had destroyed his computer's hard drive right around the time of John's murder. When they asked him why, Nathan didn't have a clear explanation. He couldn't provide a reasonable answer for why someone would destroy their own computer hard drive unless they were trying to hide something. What was on that computer that Nathan didn't want anyone to see? Were there searches about how to commit murder? Plans for the crime? Communications with someone? We'll never know because the hard drive was destroyed. But the timing, destroying the computer right around when his grandfather was killed, was extremely suspicious. Third, and perhaps most damning, investigators found a memo that Nathan had written and sent to his grandfather's trusts and estates attorney. This memo was sent before John's death. And in it, Nathan was asking very specific questions about inheritance. Specifically, Nathan wanted to know exactly what he would inherit when his grandfather died. And not just when John died, the memo also asked about what Nathan would inherit when his mother Linda died. Let me repeat that because it's so important. Before his grandfather was murdered, Nathan was already asking lawyers to clarify exactly how much money he'd get when both his grandfather and his mother were dead. Think about how chilling that is. This wasn't just idle curiosity about future inheritance. This was detailed questioning about the exact mechanics of how much money Nathan would receive when two specific family members died. The implication is clear. Nathan was thinking about, even planning for, a future where both his grandfather and his mother were dead and he had access to the family fortune. Fourth, there were questions about Nathan's alibi and his behavior after the murder. Where was Nathan on December 15, 2013? What was he doing? Who can verify his whereabouts? Investigators looked into these questions and found inconsistencies or gaps in Nathan's account of his activities. And then there was Nathan's demeanor after his grandfather's death. People noticed that Nathan seemed remarkably calm and unemotional. He didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't seem devastated or grief-stricken. He talked about his grandfather's death in a detached, almost clinical way. Now, here's where things get complicated. Nathan's father, Clark Carmen, has consistently argued throughout this case that investigators misunderstood Nathan's behavior because of his autism. People with autism spectrum disorder don't always express emotions in ways that neurotypical people expect. A person with autism might be absolutely devastated inside but appear calm or flat on the outside. They might not cry even when they're feeling profound grief. They might talk about traumatic events in a detached, matter-of-fact way because that's how their brain processes and communicates about difficult topics. Clark argues that the police saw Nathan's autistic traits. His flat affect, his logical and unemotional way of speaking, his lack of typical grief responses, and interpreted these as signs of guilt when they were really just signs of autism. This is actually a really important point. There's research showing that people with autism are sometimes wrongfully suspected or convicted of crimes because their atypical behavior is misinterpreted as suspicious or guilty. The way they answer questions, the way they express, or don't express emotions, the way they interact with authority figures, all of this can make them seem suspicious to investigators who don't understand autism. So we have two competing interpretations of the same evidence. One interpretation says, Nathan showed all the signs of being guilty. He owned a gun that matched the murder weapon and then claimed to have lost it. He destroyed his computer to hide evidence. He was asking about inheritance before the murder. His behavior afterward was cold and suspicious. The other interpretation says, Nathan is being unfairly targeted because he's autistic and doesn't behave in expected ways. He may have had a gun, but that doesn't prove he used it to kill anyone. Lots of people in New England own guns. The computer destruction might have been unrelated to the murder. The inheritance questions might have been innocent curiosity about how family trusts work. And his calm demeanor was autism, not guilt. The Windsor Police Department worked this case intensively. They interviewed Nathan multiple times. They searched for physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. They looked for the murder weapon, for forensic evidence, for witnesses, for anything that could definitively prove Nathan was guilty. And they came close. They actually drafted an arrest warrant for Nathan Carmen. They believed they had enough evidence to charge him with his grandfather's murder. But the warrant was never signed. Why not? Because the state's attorney who reviewed the case decided there wasn't quite enough concrete evidence to guarantee a conviction. Everything they had was circumstantial. Suspicious, yes. Compelling, maybe. But not definitive. There were no fingerprints at the scene that matched Nathan. No DNA evidence. No murder weapon. No witnesses who saw Nathan at his grandfather's house that day. No video footage. No confession. No smoking gun, so to speak. In the American criminal justice system, prosecutors need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And while there was plenty of reason to suspect Nathan, there was also room for doubt. A defense attorney could argue that all the evidence was circumstantial, that Nathan's autism explained his behavior, that owning a gun doesn't make someone a murderer, that asking about inheritance doesn't prove intent to kill. So the arrest warrant sat unsigned. Nathan Carmen remained free. The case remained open but inactive. The Windsor Police Department still listed John Chacalos's murder as unsolved. And the family was left in this horrible limbo where everyone suspected Nathan but nobody could prove anything. John Chacalos's death shattered the family. His 4 daughters were grief-stricken. They'd lost their father. And they were deeply divided over what to believe about Nathan. Linda's 3 sisters, Janice, Emily, and Winsome, became convinced that Nathan had killed their father. They saw all the same evidence the police saw, and they believed Nathan was guilty. They distanced themselves from Nathan and from Linda, who was caught in an impossible position. Imagine being Linda in this situation. Your father has been murdered. Your sisters believe your son did it. The police suspect your son but can't prove it. And you have to somehow navigate your grief for your father while also dealing with the fact that your only child is the prime suspect in his murder. Linda was devastated. But she was also a mother. And Nathan was her son. She couldn't just abandon him, even with all the suspicions swirling around him. Despite everything, despite the evidence and the suspicions, Linda maintained a relationship with Nathan. She continued to see him, to talk to him, to try to be his mother. She loved him. And love doesn't just disappear because people suspect the worst. Meanwhile, John's estate went into probate. The $42 million had to be sorted out and distributed according to the terms of his will and the various trusts he'd established over the years. The estate was complex. John had been a sophisticated businessman who understood estate planning. He'd set up multiple trusts and structured his assets in specific ways. The will stated that his fortune would be divided among his 4 daughters, and then their children would inherit when the daughters died. Nathan did receive some money from his grandfather's estate. Reports vary on exactly how much, but it was somewhere in the range of $500,000 to $550,000. That's a substantial amount of money for anyone, particularly for a young man in his early 20s. But it wasn't the full inheritance. It wasn't millions upon millions. It was a portion, meant to help Nathan get started in life, with the promise of much more to come when his mother eventually passed away and her share of the estate transferred to him. According to prosecutors who would later file charges, Nathan burned through that $550,000 relatively quickly. Within a couple of years, the money was gone. Nathan spent it on living expenses, on his boat, on various purchases and investments that didn't pan out. And when the money was running out, prosecutors would later allege, Nathan started thinking about how to get more. About how to access his mother's share of the fortune. About how to accelerate his inheritance. But we're getting ahead of the story. Let's stay in 2014, 2015, 2016. Nathan is living his life. His grandfather's murder is unsolved. The family is fractured. And Nathan is trying to figure out what to do with his life. Despite everything. Despite the suspicions, despite the tension, despite what Linda's sisters believed, Linda worked hard to maintain her relationship with Nathan. She was still his mother. She still loved him. And she wanted to have a connection with her son. Linda and Nathan started taking trips together. They traveled to Greece at one point, spending time together exploring a foreign country. They went on fishing trips to Canada. They were trying to find common ground, trying to have positive experiences together despite all the darkness hovering around them. Fishing became their shared activity. Nathan loved fishing. He found it peaceful, meditative, a chance to be out on the water away from people and social pressures. And even though Linda didn't particularly like fish, she didn't even eat fish herself, she went on these fishing trips because it was something they could do together. Linda was nervous about being on boats and out on the water. She wasn't naturally drawn to maritime activities. But she went anyway because she was trying to be a good mother, trying to nurture her relationship with her son. This is actually really touching when you think about it. Here's a mother who's terrified that her son might have murdered her father. Her sisters have essentially accused her son of being a killer. The police suspect him. She herself probably has doubts and fears that she can barely acknowledge. But she still shows up for him. She still takes trips with him. She still tries to find ways to connect, to have positive moments, to be his mom. Psychologists might say Linda was in denial about what Nathan might be capable of. Or maybe she genuinely believed in his innocence. Or maybe she was just doing what many mothers do, loving her child regardless of what he may or may not have done. Whatever her reasoning, Linda continued to be part of Nathan's life through 2014, 2015, and into 2016. They had their complicated relationship, their tensions, their moments of closeness and moments of conflict. But throughout all of this, there was one thing Linda did that suggested she had some concerns about Nathan. One legal action that would later seem extremely significant. In September 2013, just 3 months before John Shakalos was murdered, Linda updated her will. And in that updated will, Linda made a very specific and very clear statement. She wrote, "I have intentionally omitted Nathan and all of his descendants as beneficiaries under my will." She cut him out completely. She left her horse to a friend. She split her estate among her 3 sisters. Nathan got nothing. The will doesn't explain why Linda made this decision. There's no explanation in the document itself. But the timing is striking. September 2013, she cuts Nathan out of her will. December 2013, her father is murdered and Nathan becomes the prime suspect. Did Linda suspect her own son was capable of murder? Was she trying to remove any financial motive he might have to hurt her? Did she know or suspect something that made her feel she needed to protect herself legally? We'll never know for sure because Linda never got to explain her reasoning. She never got to tell her side of the story. But despite cutting Nathan out of her will, Linda kept being his mother. She kept taking trips with him. She kept trying to maintain their relationship. That's the complicated reality of family, love and fear and hope and doubt all mixed together. And in September 2016, Linda agreed to go on another fishing trip with Nathan. One more chance to spend time together, to be on the water, to try to have a good experience as mother and son. It was a decision that would cost Linda her life. Saturday night, September 17, 2016. Nathan and Linda drove to Ram Point Marina in South Kingstown, Rhode Island. This wasn't their first fishing trip together. They'd done this before. Nathan had a boat, and yes, he'd actually named it the Chicken Pox, which is an unusual name for a boat, but that's what Nathan chose, and they'd planned an overnight fishing trip. The destination was Block Island, which is about 13 miles off the coast of Rhode Island. Block Island is a popular destination for fishing, tourism, and day trips. The waters around it are known for good fishing, particularly for striped bass and other game fish. Nathan and Linda loaded the boat with their gear and supplies. They had coolers, fishing equipment, personal items, safety equipment. They settled into the boat as evening turned to night. The plan was simple: motor out to their fishing spot, fish overnight, and be back at the marina by noon on Sunday, September 18. They left the marina around 11 p.m. on Saturday night. Leaving at night isn't unusual for serious fishermen. Some types of fish are more active at night, and getting to a fishing spot in the evening means you can start fishing at dawn when the fish are biting. Nathan and Linda headed out into the Atlantic Ocean. The weather was decent, not perfect, but acceptable for an experienced boater. Nathan had made this trip before. He knew the waters, knew his boat, knew what he was doing. Or at least, that's what everyone assumed. The boat moved through the dark water, the lights of the Rhode Island coast slowly disappearing behind them. Linda was probably in the cabin, trying to get comfortable for the overnight trip. Nathan was likely at the helm, navigating toward their chosen fishing spot. And then, sometime that night or early the next morning, something went wrong. Or at least, that's what Nathan would later claim. Sunday afternoon came and went. Noon passed. The time when Nathan and Linda were supposed to be back at the marina. But the boat didn't appear. The slip at Ram Point Marina remained empty. At first, this might not have seemed too concerning. Fishing trips sometimes run long. Maybe they found a great spot and wanted to stay longer. Maybe they lost track of time. Maybe the boat had minor mechanical trouble that delayed them, but nothing serious. But as Sunday evening approached and there was still no word from Nathan or Linda, concerns started to grow. Linda had plans to meet friends. She was supposed to be at certain places, do certain things. When she didn't show up and didn't call or text, her friends started to worry. They tried calling her. No answer. They tried texting. No response. Linda's phone seemed to be off or out of range. By Monday morning, when Linda still hadn't contacted anyone and still hadn't returned home, her friends and family knew something was seriously wrong. Linda wasn't the type of person to just disappear without telling anyone. She was responsible. She stayed in touch. She showed up for her commitments. Her friends reported Nathan and Linda as missing. The Coast Guard was immediately notified. This triggered a massive search and rescue operation. When the Coast Guard gets a report of a missing vessel with people on board, they take it extremely seriously. Lives are at stake. The ocean is unforgiving. Every hour that passes reduces the chances of finding survivors. The Coast Guard launched one of the largest search operations in the region's recent history. They deployed helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and multiple vessels. They searched in expanding patterns from the last known location of Nathan's boat. The search area was massive. Approximately 64,000 square nautical miles. That's an enormous amount of ocean to cover. To put it in perspective, that's roughly the size of the entire state of Georgia, but spread across water where visibility is limited and conditions constantly change. Coast Guard crews flew search patterns hour after hour. They looked for any sign of the boat, any debris, any life rafts, any people in the water. They searched day and night. The water temperature was cool but not immediately life-threatening. People could survive for days in those conditions if they had flotation and protection from the elements. Other boats in the area were alerted. Commercial vessels, fishing boats, recreational boaters, everyone was asked to keep watch for any signs of Nathan and Linda or their boat. Back on land, investigators went to check Nathan's car at Ram Point Marina. And they found something odd. In Nathan's car, in the back seat, there was a bucket full of eels. Eels are common bait for fishing striped bass in New England waters. Fishermen buy or catch eels, keep them alive in buckets or coolers, and use them as bait when they're out on the water. But if Nathan and Linda had left for their fishing trip on Saturday night with the intention of actually fishing, why were the eels still in the car? Why didn't Nathan bring the bait on the boat? One investigator made an astute observation. If you left the dock and didn't take your bait, then what are you using for bait if you're going fishing? It was a small detail. Maybe Nathan just forgot the eels. Maybe he had other bait on the boat already. Maybe it was an innocent oversight. But it was strange. If you're going fishing, you bring your bait. That's basic. The Coast Guard searched for days. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They covered thousands of square miles of ocean. They looked in areas where currents might have carried a drifting vessel. They checked islands, checked shipping lanes, checked everywhere they could think of. But they found nothing. No boat. No debris. No people. No life rafts. No signs at all that Nathan and Linda had ever been out there. By the end of the week, hope was fading. The water had been searched thoroughly. If they were going to find something, they would have found it by now. The only conclusion was that Nathan and Linda had been lost at sea. Linda's 3 sisters began making funeral arrangements. They held a vigil for their sister. They grieved, they cried, they tried to come to terms with the fact that Linda was gone. That she died in the ocean doing something she didn't even enjoy, trying to be a good mother to her complicated son. The Coast Guard officially called off the search after 8 days. They'd done everything they could. They'd searched every reasonable area. The sad reality was that Nathan and Linda were presumed dead, their bodies and their boat somewhere at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. The family prepared to move forward with memorial services. Friends shared memories of Linda. People mourned the loss of a mother and her son to a tragic boating accident. And then, 8 days after Nathan and Linda disappeared, something absolutely shocking happened. On Sunday, September 25, 2016. Exactly 8 days after Nathan and Linda left the marina, a Chinese commercial freighter called the Orient Lucky was traveling through waters about 100 miles south of Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. A crew member spotted something in the water. Something small, bobbing on the waves. As they got closer, they realized it was an inflatable life raft. And there was someone in it. It was Nathan Carman. Alone. The crew of the Orient Lucky immediately prepared for rescue. They maneuvered their massive ship as close as they safely could to the small life raft. And as they were approaching, they realized the life raft was starting to sink. It was taking on water, losing buoyancy, going down. Nathan, seeing the ship approaching and seeing his raft failing, made a desperate move. He dove out of the raft and into the ocean. He swam toward the ship. The crew threw him lines, and Nathan managed to grab hold and pull himself up the side of the freighter. It was dramatic timing. Minutes later, the life raft completely sank beneath the waves. If the Orient Lucky had arrived even a little bit later, Nathan would have been in the ocean without flotation, miles from land, in a desperate situation. But he was alive. After 8 days at sea, Nathan Carmen had survived. When the crew pulled him aboard, Nathan was in rough shape. He was severely sunburned. His skin was red and peeling. He was dehydrated. He was clearly exhausted. But he was conscious, he could speak, and he was going to be okay. The crew gave Nathan water, food, medical attention. They radioed the Coast Guard to report the rescue. And they began transporting Nathan back to land. The media exploded with the story. Man survives 8 days at sea. Son found alive after boating tragedy. Miracle rescue in Atlantic Ocean. The headlines painted Nathan as a heroic survivor, someone who had endured an unimaginable ordeal and managed to stay alive through resourcefulness and determination. The initial reaction from most people was relief and amazement. Thank goodness Nathan survived. What a miracle. What a terrible tragedy that his mother was lost, but at least her son made it. The family must be so grateful to have Nathan back, even though they'd lost Linda. But not everyone was relieved. Some people, particularly Linda's sisters, were immediately suspicious. Because they remembered what had happened 3 years earlier. They remembered that Nathan had been the prime suspect in their father's murder. And now, Nathan's mother was conveniently dead, and Nathan was the only survivor to tell the story of what happened. When Nathan was brought back to shore and had recovered enough to talk to investigators and the media, he told his version of what happened on that fishing trip. According to Nathan, they'd been out on the water for about 12 hours when the boat started taking on water. He didn't know why. There was no obvious reason. The boat just started filling with water. Nathan said he and his mother tried to bail out the water, tried to keep the boat afloat. They used buckets, they used pumps, they tried everything they could think of. But the water kept coming in faster than they could get it out. The boat was sinking. They both realized they needed to get to the life raft. The life raft was their only chance for survival. Nathan said that Linda went to get into the life raft. But then, and this is where his story gets vague and concerning, she just wasn't there anymore. Nathan claimed he didn't actually see what happened to his mother. One moment she was there, the next moment she was gone. Did she fall in the water? Did she get swept overboard? Did she have a heart attack or stroke? Nathan said he didn't know. He said everything happened so fast, there was so much chaos with the boat sinking, that he lost track of what happened to Linda. The boat went under. Nathan managed to get himself into the life raft. And then he was alone on the ocean for 8 days. Nathan described his survival in detail. He talked about the emergency supplies in the life raft, water packets, food rations, flares, a radio beacon. He talked about rationing the food and water carefully to make it last. He talked about watching for ships and planes, hoping for rescue. He talked about the sun beating down on him day after day, causing the severe sunburn that was evident when he was rescued. He described it all very calmly, very methodically. He walked through his survival step by step in a logical, almost detached way. He thanked the crew of the Orient Lucky. He thanked the Coast Guard for searching. He expressed sadness that his mother hadn't survived but gratitude that he had. And that calm, methodical, unemotional way of telling the story, that's what started making people suspicious. To many people watching and listening to Nathan's interviews, something felt off. Here was a young man who just lost his mother at sea and survived 8 days alone on the ocean. That's traumatic. That's devastating. Most people would be crying, would be overwhelmed with emotion, would be barely able to get through telling the story. But Nathan seemed fine. He was calm. He was articulate. He spoke about the experience like he was describing a mildly interesting trip to the grocery store, not a life-or-death ordeal. Now, as Nathan's father Clark would repeatedly point out, this is exactly the kind of reaction you'd expect from someone with autism. People on the autism spectrum often don't display emotions in ways that neurotypical people expect. Nathan could be absolutely devastated inside while appearing completely calm on the outside. His logical, detailed way of describing the event could be how his autistic brain processes trauma. Clark argued that Nathan's autism is actually what saved his life. He said, because of his autism, because of his ability to be alone, Nathan, of any individual that I know, could have coped with being lost at sea. The very traits that made Nathan seem suspicious, his calmness, his lack of visible emotion, his ability to be alone without panicking, these were the traits that kept him alive. But to investigators and to the public, Nathan's demeanor seemed wrong. It seemed like someone who wasn't actually traumatized by what happened. It seemed like someone who knew exactly what was going to happen and had prepared for it. And then Nathan did something that made him look even more suspicious. Within weeks of being rescued, while his mother's body still hadn't been found, while her death was still fresh and her family was still grieving, Nathan filed an insurance claim. He filed a claim for $85,000 for his sunken boat. His mother was missing, presumed dead, and Nathan was already trying to collect insurance money. The optics were terrible. It looked greedy, callous, like someone who cared more about money than about his mother. The insurance company took one look at Nathan's claim and said absolutely not. They denied the claim immediately. And then they went further, they sued Nathan, alleging insurance fraud. They said there were too many problems with his story, too many things that didn't add up. Insurance companies don't like paying out large claims, that's just business reality. But this went beyond normal insurance company skepticism. The insurance company hired maritime experts, oceanographers, naval architects, and investigators. They conducted their own thorough investigation into what happened to Nathan's boat. And what they found was deeply troubling. First, they looked at where Nathan was rescued compared to where he claimed the boat sank. They hired oceanographers to model the currents and wind patterns in that area during those 8 days. Based on their analysis, if a life raft had been drifting naturally from where Nathan said the boat went down, it should have drifted west. The currents and winds would have pushed it in a westerly direction. But Nathan was found to the east. Far to the east of where he should have been if his story was true and he'd been drifting helplessly for 8 days. There are only a few ways to explain this discrepancy. Either Nathan was wrong about where the boat sank. Or Nathan wasn't actually drifting helplessly, he was controlling where the raft went, possibly even using a motor or oars that he later disposed of. Or Nathan hadn't been out at sea for 8 full days. Maybe he'd been hiding closer to shore for several days and only went out to the deep ocean more recently. None of these explanations made Nathan look good. Second, investigators interviewed people who had seen Nathan at the marina in the days before the fishing trip. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Nathan working on his boat with power tools, specifically a drill. They said he was removing trim tabs from the boat. Trim tabs are these devices attached to the stern of a boat that help with stability and control. They're important structural components. If you remove trim tabs, you create holes in the hull. And holes in the hull let water in. Why would someone remove trim tabs right before a fishing trip? The only answer that made sense to investigators was that Nathan was deliberately creating holes in his boat. He was sabotaging it. He was setting it up to sink. Third, investigators discovered some unusual purchases Nathan had made shortly before the fishing trip. He'd bought an anchor. But not just any anchor, he'd bought an anchor that was incompatible with his boat. It was the wrong type, the wrong size, wouldn't properly attach to his boat's anchor system. Why would you buy an anchor that doesn't work with your boat? Unless you weren't planning to use it as an anchor. Unless you were planning to use it to weigh something else down. Like, hypothetically, a body. Nathan had also purchased lengths of chain. Heavy chain. The kind you might use to attach something heavy to something you want to sink to the ocean floor. Fourth, investigators looked at Nathan's behavior when the boat allegedly started taking on water. According to standard maritime safety protocols, if your vessel is taking on water and sinking, you're supposed to do several things immediately. You call for help on the radio. You activate your emergency beacon so rescuers can locate you. You deploy flares to signal your location to any nearby vessels. Nathan did none of these things. He didn't radio for help. He didn't activate the beacon until after the boat had already sunk. He didn't use flares. His explanation was that everything happened too fast, there wasn't time. But investigators didn't buy that. If the boat was really sinking unexpectedly, Nathan would have had time to grab the radio and send a mayday. That's what everyone does. It's instinct. Unless, of course, you don't actually want to be rescued. Unless you want the boat to sink and disappear with no one knowing where or when it happened. And fifth, there were the modifications Nathan had made to the boat in the weeks and months before the trip. He'd drilled holes. He'd removed structural components. He'd weakened the hull in multiple places. A marine surveyor who later examined the evidence concluded that Nathan's modifications would have made the boat significantly less seaworthy. All of this evidence together painted a disturbing picture. It suggested that Nathan had spent weeks deliberately sabotaging his own boat, making it more likely to sink. He'd purchased equipment that could be used to weigh down a body. He'd removed the bait from his car, suggesting the fishing trip was never really about fishing. And then he'd taken his mother out on this compromised vessel, let it sink, and survived 8 days at sea while his mother conveniently disappeared without a trace. As federal prosecutors and FBI investigators pieced together all the evidence, they developed a theory about what really happened on that fishing trip. And their theory was chilling. According to the prosecution, here's what actually occurred. Nathan Carman had burned through the $550,000 he inherited from his grandfather. The money was gone. He needed more. His mother Linda was worth over $2 million in her own right, plus she had a share of the remaining $42 million Shakalos estate that was still working its way through probate. Even though Linda had cut Nathan out of her will, prosecutors believed Nathan thought he could still get access to her money. If Linda died before the grandfather's estate was fully settled, Nathan might be able to challenge the will or make claims on the estate as her only child and next of kin. Even if he couldn't get everything, he'd get something. And something was better than nothing when you're running out of money. So Nathan began planning his mother's murder. And he decided to make it look like a tragic boating accident. Over a period of weeks, Nathan systematically sabotaged his own boat. He drilled holes. He removed trim tabs. He weakened the hull. He did everything he could to ensure that when they got far enough offshore, the boat would sink. He bought an anchor and chain that he could use to weigh down Linda's body so it would never be found. He convinced Linda to go on this fishing trip with him. Probably wasn't hard, fishing was their thing, their way of connecting. Linda wanted to maintain their relationship. She agreed to go. They left the marina on Saturday night, September 17th. But Nathan didn't take the bait from his car because he wasn't planning to fish. This was never about fishing. This was about getting his mother far enough offshore that what he was planning to do would never be discovered. Once they were far enough out, Nathan killed Linda. The prosecution's theory doesn't specify exactly how, whether he drugged her first, whether he hit her, whether he pushed her overboard while she was still alive or killed her first and then threw her body overboard. But somehow, Linda died. Nathan then attached the anchor and chains to Linda's body and threw her overboard, letting her sink to the ocean floor where she would never be found. Then he deliberately sank his own boat, completing the destruction of evidence. But Nathan didn't get into the life raft and immediately start drifting. That's where the oceanographic evidence becomes important. Investigators believe Nathan actually stayed close to the Connecticut and Rhode Island coastlines for the first several days. He may have hidden in coves or inlets, waiting for the right amount of time to pass. Why? Because if he'd been found right away, the timeline wouldn't make sense. People would ask questions. It needed to look like he'd been drifting helplessly for days. So Nathan waited. After about a week, when he figured enough time had elapsed, Nathan made his move. He paddled or motored his life raft out into open water, into the shipping lanes where he knew commercial vessels regularly passed. He positioned himself where he'd likely be spotted. And then, right before the Orient Lucky came into view, he deliberately sank his own life raft so there would be no evidence of how he'd actually spent those 8 days. When the crew spotted him, his raft was conveniently sinking, so they couldn't examine it. He swam to the ship, was rescued, and told his carefully prepared story about the boat mysteriously taking on water and his mother mysteriously disappearing. It was almost perfect. No body to examine. No boat to investigate. No evidence except Nathan's word about what happened. Just a tragic accident that left a young man orphaned and in line to inherit millions once the estate drama sorted itself out. Almost perfect. But not quite. The challenge for prosecutors was the same challenge the Windsor police had faced with John Chacalos's murder. How do you prove it? Everything they had was circumstantial. Suspicious, compelling, but circumstantial. They didn't have Linda's body. They couldn't prove she was murdered rather than accidentally drowned. They didn't have the boat. They couldn't definitively prove it had been deliberately sabotaged. They didn't have witnesses. No one saw what happened out on the ocean. They didn't have a confession. Nathan consistently maintained his innocence. What they had was suspicious boat modifications, strange purchases, questionable timeline and location, lack of following safety protocols, Nathan's history as a suspect in his grandfather's murder, the financial motive, and expert testimony about how unlikely Nathan's version of events was. Is that enough to convict someone of murder beyond a reasonable doubt? That's what would have to be decided at trial. For nearly 6 years after Linda's disappearance, the investigation continued. The FBI built their case. They consulted with experts. They gathered evidence. They prepared for the day when they'd feel confident enough to bring charges. And finally, in May 2022, they were ready. On May 10, 2022, 5 years and 8 months after Linda Carmen disappeared at sea, federal agents arrested Nathan Carmen. He was 28 years old at the time. The indictment was extensive. 9 pages detailing multiple charges: murder of Linda Carmen on the high seas, multiple counts of fraud related to the insurance claims, and conspiracy to commit fraud. But the indictment went even further. It specifically stated that prosecutors believed Nathan's murder of Linda was part of a scheme to obtain money and property from the estate of John Chacalos and related family trusts. In other words, even though Nathan had never been charged with killing his grandfather, the federal prosecutors were essentially saying, "We think you killed your grandfather in 2013 for his money, and when that money ran out, you killed your mother in 2016 for her money." 2 murders, both motivated by greed, both part of a larger plan to get your hands on a $42 million fortune. Nathan pleaded not guilty to all charges. His attorney gave statements to the press arguing that the case against Nathan was built on suspicion and speculation, not solid evidence. They emphasized Nathan's autism and how it affected his behavior and communication. They said investigators had tunnel vision and were seeing guilt where there was only tragedy and misunderstanding. The stage was set for what promised to be a blockbuster trial. The evidence would be presented. Expert witnesses would testify. Nathan would have his day in court. A jury would hear everything and make a decision about whether Nathan Carmen was a tragic figure who'd lost his grandfather and mother in separate tragedies, or a cold-blooded killer who'd murdered them both for money. The trial was scheduled for October 2023. Months of preparation began. Both sides gathered their evidence, prepared their witnesses, crafted their strategies. But the trial never happened. Because in June 2023, everything changed. On June 15, 2023, Nathan Carman was found unresponsive in his cell at the Cheshire County Jail in Keene, New Hampshire. He'd been held there while awaiting trial, unable to make bail. Jail staff immediately called for medical assistance. First responders arrived quickly. They tried everything: CPR, a defibrillator, medications, advanced life support. They worked on Nathan for 40 minutes, desperately trying to revive him. But it was too late. Nathan Carman was pronounced dead at the scene. He was only 29 years old. An autopsy was performed. The medical examiner ruled Nathan's death a suicide. He had taken his own life in his cell. There were no signs of foul play. No evidence that anyone else was involved. Nathan had been alone, and he had made a choice to end his life. His attorney reported that they found a note in Nathan's cell, but it wasn't a suicide note explaining why he'd taken his life. Instead, it was a note about his case, about the charges, about the evidence. Nathan left no explanation for his family, no confession, no apology, no final words about what really happened to his grandfather or his mother. He simply ended his life, taking whatever he knew to the grave with him. Nathan's death meant the criminal case against him was over. You can't prosecute a dead person. All the charges were formally dismissed. There would be no trial, no verdict, no opportunity for the truth to come out in court. For Linda's sisters. Nathan's aunts, who had believed for years that Nathan killed their father and their sister, Nathan's suicide felt like a confirmation of guilt. They believed he killed himself because he knew he was going to be convicted. He knew the evidence would prove what he'd done, and he couldn't face spending the rest of his life in prison. But Nathan's father Clark maintained, even after Nathan's death, that his son was innocent. Clark believed Nathan couldn't handle the stress and pressure of being falsely accused. He believed Nathan took his own life because he was facing the possibility of life in prison for crimes he didn't commit, and his autism made it difficult for him to cope with that level of stress and uncertainty. These two interpretations, guilt versus innocence, murderer versus victim, would never be resolved. Because without a trial, without Nathan's own testimony, without a jury's verdict, there would never be a definitive answer to what really happened. Interestingly, despite everything, despite believing Nathan had murdered their father and sister, Linda's sisters attended Nathan's funeral. Family is complicated. Even when you believe someone has done terrible things, they're still family. The relationships, the history, the shared DNA, these things don't just disappear. The estate battles continue to this day. John Chacalos's $42 million fortune has been tied up in probate court for over a decade now. Linda's estate, worth over $2 million, is also still in legal limbo. The money that supposedly motivated these murders, if they were murders, remains undistributed, tied up in legal proceedings that seem endless. John Chacalos's murder remains officially unsolved. The Windsor Police Department still lists it as an open case. With Nathan dead and no other suspects, it's unlikely to ever be officially closed, but it's also unlikely any new evidence will emerge after all these years. And Linda's body has never been found. Investigators believe she's still at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, possibly somewhere off the Connecticut coast, possibly weighted down with an anchor and chain. Her final resting place is unknown, and likely will remain unknown forever. As we come toward the end of this story, let's take a moment to think about what we actually know versus what we believe or suspect. We know that John Chacalos was murdered in December 2013. That's a fact. An 87-year-old man was shot to death in his home. Someone killed him. We know that Nathan Carman was the prime suspect in that murder, but was never charged. That's also a fact. Police drafted an arrest warrant, but it was never signed due to lack of sufficient evidence. We know that Linda Carman disappeared at sea in September 2016 during a fishing trip with Nathan. We know Nathan survived and Linda didn't. We know Nathan filed an insurance claim for his sunken boat. We know that federal prosecutors charged Nathan with Linda's murder and fraud in May 2022, alleging it was part of a scheme that also involved his grandfather's death. And we know that Nathan died by suicide in June 2023 before his trial could take place. Those are the undisputed facts. Everything else, whether Nathan actually killed his grandfather, whether he actually killed his mother, what his true motivations were, whether the evidence against him proved guilt or just unfortunate circumstances, all of that remains in the realm of interpretation and belief rather than proven fact. One of the most important and complicated questions in this case is how much Nathan's autism affected both his behavior and how that behavior was interpreted by others. People with autism spectrum disorder are sometimes wrongfully suspected or convicted of crimes because their atypical behavior is misunderstood. They might not show emotions in expected ways. They might speak in flat, unemotional tones even about traumatic events. They might not make appropriate eye contact. They might give answers that seem evasive when they're actually just being very literal. All of these traits can make someone with autism seem suspicious or guilty to investigators and jurors who don't understand autism. There's documented research on this phenomenon. It's a real problem in the criminal justice system. So when Nathan showed no emotion talking about his grandfather's death, was that guilt or autism? When he calmly described surviving 8 days at sea, was that because he'd planned the whole thing or because his autistic brain processes trauma differently? When he gave answers that seemed evasive during questioning, was he hiding something or just being literal and precise in the way autistic people often are? Nathan's father Clark has been adamant that Nathan's autism explains everything that made him seem suspicious. Clark believes the police and prosecutors saw what they wanted to see, interpreting autism as guilt. But Linda's sisters believe Nathan used his autism as an excuse and a shield. They think he was fully capable of understanding his actions and their consequences, and he committed murder twice. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Nathan's autism was real and did affect how he behaved and communicated. But having autism doesn't make someone incapable of committing crimes. People with autism can and sometimes do commit violent crimes, just like neurotypical people can. The question isn't whether Nathan's autism was real, it clearly was. The question is whether his autism explains the suspicious circumstances around 2 deaths, or whether Nathan committed 2 murders and his autism just made him seem even more suspicious because his reactions didn't match what people expected. We'll never know the answer to that question. Nathan never testified. He never explained himself fully. He took his secrets to the grave. One thing that's hard to ignore in this case is the money. $42 million is a lot of money. It's the kind of money people kill for. History is full of cases where family members murdered each other over far less. Nathan received about $550,000 after his grandfather died. According to prosecutors, he burned through that money within a couple of years. By 2016, he needed more money. His mother's share of the estate, combined with her own assets, would have been worth millions. If Nathan killed his grandfather and then his mother, the financial motive makes perfect sense. He needed money, they had money, and he eliminated them to get access to that money. But if Nathan didn't kill anyone, then the financial motive is just a coincidence. Nathan inherited money because that's what happens when family members die, their estate gets distributed to the next generation. Nathan running low on money in 2016 might just be a young man in his 20s making poor financial decisions, not evidence of murder. The problem with financial motives is they're compelling but not proof. Lots of people inherit money without murdering anyone. Lots of people run out of money without killing their relatives to get more. Having a financial motive doesn't prove someone acted on that motive. But it does make investigators suspicious. And in Nathan's case, combined with all the other circumstantial evidence, the financial motive was damning. Perhaps the most frustrating thing about this case is that we'll never really know if the evidence was strong enough to convict Nathan. We'll never know what a jury would have decided after hearing all the testimony and seeing all the evidence. The circumstantial case against Nathan was substantial. The boat modifications. The suspicious purchases. The oceanographic evidence about where he was found. His history as a suspect in his grandfather's murder. The financial motive. His lack of following safety protocols when the boat allegedly started sinking. The missing bait. His calm demeanor. The insurance fraud. All of that together paints a picture of someone who planned 2 murders for financial gain. It's compelling. Many people believe the evidence clearly shows Nathan was guilty. But circumstantial evidence has limitations. There's no physical proof. No body showing evidence of murder rather than drowning. No confession. No witnesses. No smoking gun. A good defense attorney could have argued that everything prosecutors pointed to had innocent explanations. Maybe Nathan removed trim tabs for legitimate maintenance reasons. Maybe he bought the wrong anchor by mistake. Maybe his raft drifted east due to unusual currents. Maybe he didn't radio for help because he panicked. Maybe his autism explained his behavior. Maybe it was all just terrible coincidences and tragic accidents. Would a jury have believed that? We'll never know. Some jurors might have found reasonable doubt. Others might have been convinced of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's why we have trials, to let juries weigh the evidence and make decisions. But Nathan's suicide meant there would never be a trial, never be a verdict, never be a definitive legal conclusion to this case. Nathan's suicide raises its own questions. Why did he take his life? What does his death tell us about his guilt or innocence? People who believe Nathan was guilty see his suicide as essentially a confession. They believe he knew the evidence against him was strong. He knew he was going to be convicted. And rather than spend the rest of his life in prison, he chose to end his life on his own terms. In this interpretation, Nathan's suicide is the final proof that he was guilty all along. But people who believe Nathan was innocent see his suicide differently. They see a young man with autism who couldn't cope with the stress of being wrongly accused. They see someone who was facing life in prison for crimes he didn't commit, who felt hopeless and overwhelmed. They see his death as a tragedy, not a confession. They point out that innocent people sometimes take their own lives when facing criminal charges because the pressure becomes unbearable. Both interpretations are possible. Guilty people do sometimes take their lives rather than face trial and conviction. But innocent people also sometimes take their lives when facing overwhelming accusations and potential wrongful conviction. Nathan's suicide doesn't definitively prove anything except that he was in such profound distress that death seemed preferable to continuing to live. Whether that distress came from guilt and fear of punishment, or from innocence and fear of wrongful conviction, we can't know. At the end of all this, regardless of what really happened, there are families who have lost people they loved. John Chacalosa's daughters lost their father. Whether he was murdered by his grandson or by someone else, he's still gone. His life was violently ended. His family has spent over a decade without answers, without justice, without closure. Linda's sisters lost their sister. They believe she was murdered by her own son, which adds an extra layer of horror to an already terrible loss. They've had to grieve while also dealing with anger and frustration that Nathan was never convicted, never held accountable, never punished for what they believe he did. Clark Carman lost his son. Whether Nathan was guilty or innocent, Clark has lost his only child. And he's had to watch as his son was accused of terrible crimes, held in jail, and ultimately died by suicide. That's a parent's worst nightmare. And the extended family has lost multiple members and has been torn apart by suspicion, anger, and grief. Family gatherings must be impossible. Holidays must be painful. The inheritance that was supposed to provide financial security for generations has instead become a source of pain, division, and trauma. Nobody won in this story. Even if Nathan was guilty and got away with 2 murders, he still ended up dead at age 29 in a jail cell. Even if he was innocent and wrongly accused, he still lost his freedom and his life. The money that supposedly motivated everything remains tied up in court, benefiting no one. This is a story without winners, without clean resolutions, without satisfying conclusions. As you drift off to sleep listening to the rain, think about this case and what it tells us about family, wealth, justice, and truth. It reminds us that families are complicated. Even wealthy families with every advantage can be dysfunctional, can have serious problems, can harbor dark secrets. Money doesn't solve relationship problems, sometimes it makes them worse. It reminds us that the criminal justice system isn't perfect. Sometimes guilty people go free because there isn't quite enough evidence. Sometimes investigations take years or decades. Sometimes we never get definitive answers. It reminds us that autism and other neurological differences can affect how people are perceived in criminal cases. We need to be careful about reading too much into someone's demeanor or way of speaking, especially when they're on the spectrum. It reminds us that grief is complicated. Linda's sisters attended Nathan's funeral despite believing he murdered their father and sister. Family bonds don't disappear even when terrible things happen. Love and hate, grief and anger. They can all exist together. And it reminds us that truth is sometimes elusive. We want clear answers. We want to know definitely what happened. But sometimes, all we have are theories, suspicions, beliefs. Sometimes the people who know the truth die before they can share it. So what do you believe about Nathan Carmen? Was he a misunderstood young man with autism who suffered two terrible tragedies and couldn't cope with being wrongly accused? Or was he a calculating killer who murdered his grandfather and mother for money, nearly got away with it, and took his secrets to the grave? The evidence is there for you to interpret. The facts are known. But the truth, the real, complete truth about what happened in December 2013 in Windsor, Connecticut and September 2016 in the Atlantic Ocean, that truth died with Nathan Carmen on June 15, 2023. Rest in peace to John Chocolos, murdered in his own home, his killer never definitively identified. Rest in peace to Linda Carmen, lost at sea, her final moments known only to the ocean and possibly to her son. And rest in peace to Nathan Carmen, whether he was a victim of circumstance or a perpetrator of terrible crimes. Either way, his troubled life ended far too soon. The $42 million inheritance that was supposed to secure a family's future for generations instead became the center of a mystery that destroyed that family entirely. The money remains, tied up in legal proceedings. But the people it was meant to help are gone. Maybe that's the real lesson of this story. Money can't buy happiness. It can't prevent tragedy. And sometimes, the pursuit of money, or the suspicion that someone pursued money through terrible means, can destroy everything else that matters. As you fall asleep tonight, be grateful for what you have. Be grateful for family relationships that are healthy, even if they're not perfect. Be grateful that you're not facing the kind of questions and suspicions that plagued Nathan Carmen. And remember that some mysteries don't get solved. Some questions don't get answered. Sometimes, all we can do is acknowledge the tragedy, mourn the losses, and move forward without the closure we wish we could have. Good night, everyone. Sleep well. And remember that the truth, whatever it is, matters less than how we treat each other while we're here. End of script. Total runtime approximately 60+ minutes at 120 to 140 words per minute with rain sounds. This script is designed for sleep listening with gentle rain sounds. The pacing is intentionally slower and more contemplative than typical true crime videos, with detailed exploration of complex themes and careful consideration of multiple perspectives. All information is based on the Netflix documentary, The Carmen Family Deaths, and publicly available court records and news reports.